Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got a very special one indeed. We're jumping over to a single state, single style, but different brewers. Today, it's going to be California Craft Barrel-Aged Imperial Stouts. And we're going to be starting with a brewer that I've been hearing a lot about for the last couple of years. This will be the very first beer I've ever had from them. They are winning awards left and right. Established in California in 1996. They have quickly garnered a reputation as one of the best craft beer brewers in the country and specializing in barrel aging. This is Firestone Walker Brewing Company. Today we're having one of their most celebrated beers that they put out different releases every year. This is the 2020 release of Parabola. It's an Imperial Stout that clocks in at 13.6% ABV. This is a big one. They're based in Paso Robles, California, and this one specifically was bourbon barrel aged. So if all the hype lives up to it, I think I'm going to be in for a treat. Number two, this is 50 Brewing Company's Eclipse Rye Cuvee. This is a rye whiskey barrel aged Imperial Stout, clocks in at 12.8% ABV. They're based in Truckee, California. Now, I've had a few different beers from 50 and a couple in their Eclipse line, and honestly, I thought both of the ones that I have had have been among the best stouts I've ever had in my life. So we're looking at what I expect is going to be two heavy hitters, probably a unique beer drinking experience between the two, but I'm just expecting to have my mind and my beer-loving taste buds blown here today. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in with Firestone Walker's Parabola 2020 that clocks in at 13.6% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in to the first beer of today's California Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout review, we have got Firestone Walker Brewing Company's Parabola 2020 release. This is a bourbon barrel-aged Imperial Stout that clocks in at 13.6% ABV. They're based in Paso Robles, California. So first things first, I mentioned in the intro, Firestone Walker, first beer I've had from them, and how much hype has been surrounded by this brewery. Their beers sell out very quickly. They're hard to get your hands on, especially if you live so far away down in Florida like me. Thankfully, Tavour has come through yet again, so I'm finally able to get my hands on one of these beers. In terms of label art, they've got a very clean design. It's just got some barrels under kind of an arch with their name in it. So very plain, very subdued. Now on the front, it also does specify their original gravity. It gives the IBUs, this one says 55. They say they're using British ale yeast, which is a house yeast. They produced 3,000 cases of this one, and the SRM, that's the depth of color, is 149, which they say registers midnight black. So you get quite a lot of information on the label on this beer, which you don't get on a lot of beers, but I think that's very cool. And then on the cap, it's got what looks like a very fit bear that's in a boxing pose. I don't know if the camera's picking that up or not, but pretty neat. So let's get this cracked gently. All right. Get this poured right in the old stout glass here. I'm expecting this will be quite dark and thick. Oh, you know, surprisingly, it's not pouring as dark as I expected, nor as thick. But it looks like it's going to have a decent shot at forming a decent head here. Give a little more agitation. Yeah, that did a pretty good job. And once it's in the glass, of course, it looks a lot darker. Now, the first thing I noticed immediately is the pungency of aroma. I'm probably 1.5 feet away from the rim of that glass, and it is massive. You can smell just a ton of that bourbon barrel that's coming through. There's also a lot of underlying vanilla and molasses and kind of really rich caramel notes that are coming out of this glass. So visually, yeah, visually it is pitch black. It didn't look quite as thick or dark as I was pouring it, but in the glass, yes, it is. It's pitch black. There was no light getting through there. From a nice little creamy pad right on top, let's get right over for a sniff. Oh yeah, absolutely. I can smell even more clearly. Big bourbon coming through. You can smell that barrel straight away. And once you get right up on it, the aroma, the vanilla, and the subtler accents I was picking up, they get a lot more pronounced. So there's a big nose of vanilla here, as well as that bourbon. There is a ton of molasses here. There's a ton of what smells like caramelized sugars, very dark caramel, not a light caramel, one that's been caramelized. The sugars have been caramelized much more deeply. There's a lot of interesting aromas coming out of here. One more sniff. There's even some suggestions of fig on here. So it does kind of remind me of a barrel-aged cross between an Imperial Stout and a barley wine. That's how it smells. So let's jump in and see how it tastes. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, man. Oh, this right here is incredible stout. Good God. Okay, this is one of those, I had a suspicion it would live up to the hype. This is one of those that is kind of in that best you ever had category, the life-altering, the I can't believe that beer is that good kind of category that you make that list for yourself. This is one of those. This actually puts me in mind of a lot of different beers, but the first thing that jumped out at me is the absolute incredible intensity of flavor. As soon as you get it in your mouth and start to agitate, it just bursts with flavor. Everything you pick up in that aroma comes through quite clearly. The bourbon, the molasses, the vanilla, the caramel, the caramelized sugars, and as soon as you swallow, this is where I was really surprised and pleasantly so. Just the biggest intense of roast that came out of left field. In fact, they didn't specify it as a Russian Imperial Stout, though I saw allusions to it being categorized as such by some reviewing sites. And indeed, if that is the case, I could see it because it does taste a whole lot like a Russian Imperial Stout that's been expertly barrel-aged here. The intensity of roast and just rich, rich baker's chocolate, a slight coffee edge to it, just that intensity and the bitters that came through. 55 IBUs doesn't sound that high on an Imperial Stout. I could go either way how it's going to hit your palate, but I could tell you behind that nice sweet bourbon with all those candied sugars and caramel, you get just this, it's almost like having two beers in one. There's this lighter candy, caramelly, that's still rich, mind you, but it's lighter and suggests sweetness without being sweet. And then you just get this face full of intense roast. Just intense beyond all belief. Wow. I'm absolutely blown away by this one. This is an incredibly well done beer. And to state that it's delicious is really a massive understatement. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, finish, try to pick out this flavor development a bit more. This one is just transcendent. Okay, I'm letting my brain process the flavors before I start to tell you about the body and the mouthfeel. Yeah, okay. So, the body, I would say, is medium heavy, which surprises me greatly. 13.6%, I rather anticipated this huge, robust body. It's got a nice presence, but it's nowhere near as robust as you maybe would perhaps anticipate for this style in this ABV range. The mouthfeel is a similar story here. It's got some resistance. It's got a little bit of creaminess as you agitate around the palate, but it's not over the top in either category. It's not anywhere near as resistant as I expected, and it's not anywhere near as creamy as I expected. But it's very smooth, and frankly, the body and the mouthfeel are balanced perfectly together. A medium heavy with a resistant but not high-end resistant mouthfeel. It pairs very well together, so it feels right. It's maybe not as big as I expected, but it absolutely feels right. In terms of the finish, incredibly long. Beyond incredibly long. And its intensity of flavors from the full kit and caboodle. So it's big, bold, intense bourbon, big, bold, intense vanilla and caramelized sugars and caramel, big, bold, intense roast and coffee and chocolate. I mean, it's all in there, and I cannot begin to describe to you how intense the flavor is lingering on the end of this finish. It is positively intense and long. Easily one of the longest stout finishes I've ever had. Now, in terms of the flavors, I'm gonna come back to it on my second sip. Everything I got on the first sip, I got again on the second sip. Really what struck me on the second sip was a little more intensifying of all of the above, but notably that roasty quality underneath, which was kind of a surprise to my palate at first. I didn't anticipate it, and then it came through, and I was grateful that it did. But the intensity that it comes through on that second sip is absolutely insane. So you definitely get that barrel up front. You're getting massive notes of bourbon, massive notes of vanilla, tons of molasses, tons of caramelized sugars, and then you're getting just rich, deep cacao. It's cacao or baker's chocolate, just big, intense. It's not sweet. It's that proper, unrefined, unmixed with sugar chocolate and a little bit of a coffee side. There's a slight smokiness to it, but it's not what I would call smoky like you would term a Rauch beer or like a peated scotch or anything like that at all. It's much more akin to one of those where it's more in a line of a very deeply roasted coffee bean. And yes, there are some coffee elements in this, but it's not intensely of coffee. It's much more intense roast with a slight smoky edge. Absolutely delicious. I understand fully why people have been going on about Firestone Walker, why their beers sell out so quickly, why they're so hard to find, because this truly is world-class stout. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, go with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review. That is 50 Brewing Company's Eclipse Rye Cuvee. That one clocks in at 12.8% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's California-based barrel-aged Imperial Stout review. We have got 50 Brewing Company's Eclipse. This is the Rye Cuvee version. Clocks in at 12.8% ABV. They're based in Truckee, California, and this one is, of course, a rye whiskey barrel-aged Imperial Stout. True to Eclipse fashion, it's got an eclipse on there. They always have very cool looking label art. It's very subdued, but it looks very neat. And before I jump into the beer here, as I score under the cap because of the wax, no, you're not crazy. Yes, I did change my shirt. Reason being, the shirt that I had, a button that I had sewed back on years ago decided to fall off, and I am terrible at sewing buttons back on shirts, and I didn't want to take 20 minutes to have to fix it. So I just grabbed a new one. So no, you're not crazy. Yes, it is a different shirt. But back to the beer. Okay, this got a nice thick ring of wax underneath it. I scored very deeply down to the glass, so I'm hoping that'll give me some leverage to get this off on the first try. Yes it did. And I can hear wax falling all over the floor. I like to clean up the rim, keeps any little wax pieces dropping down, and not the end of the world, but I don't particularly like when I get wax in my beer. I've done it before. It's not the greatest thing, but nonetheless, let's get this poured. Yep, that's looking pretty stinking thick and very dark. It's looking pretty effervescent too, so I'm guessing it's going to have a good shot at forming a decent head here. Back off, we're obviously not getting this whole bottle in there any way you slice it. Yeah, that's a lovely looking beer, forming a beautiful head, and I can tell you I can smell it clearly. It's just like the first one, got a very pronounced aroma. Pitch black, as expected, big, frothy, foamy head on top. So let's get right up over this for a proper sniff. Yeah. Not a dissimilar aroma to the first, to be honest. Rye whiskey is not that dissimilar to how you would produce a bourbon, other than it's brewed with at least 51% rye versus corn for bourbon. So it smells similar. It's got this distinct, most people will probably describe it as a bourbon or a whiskey-like aroma from the barrel, but this happens to be a rye whiskey. And it's got the same kind of molasses and slightly vanilla kind of overtones to it. Doesn't smell boozy, just distinctly can smell that spirit barrel. I am getting a little hint of figs and dates, so again, not dissimilar to the first beer. That vanilla sweetness, there is a little underlying sweetness as well. And you can smell there's some roasty malts. But overall, it's barrel and kind of that richer caramelly and molasses side that's coming through most prominently on the nose. Head has settled down a little bit, but it's holding true. Just look at that. That's very, very thick indeed. That would not look out of place atop a Guinness. So we're just going to jump right in, make a mess in the mustache. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's a very, very nice beer. Okay. So, first thing that I noticed right out of the gate was the initial, when you get it in your mouth and start to agitate it around, very similar experience to the first beer. That barrel is very, very prominent. The difference with this one is I wasn't getting quite as much sweetness on the front side as I was in the first beer, and it was just a lot more intensity of that barrel. So what you were smelling on the nose really came through, but really not but just a minor bit of a slight suggestion of sweetness that comes through. Much more focus on the actual flavor of the rye whiskey that the barrel's imparting. Behind that, there was a little hint of vanilla, though in general rye whiskeys don't have as many forward vanilla-like notes as you would find in a bourbon. So there's a little bit there, but it's not overwhelming. And behind that, it just intensified, and then the malt bill started to creep through, and right as that was starting to happen, there was a little bit of a boozy bite to it. There is a little bit of a booziness to this beer, but you know, some people dislike that. You've watched a lot of my reviews, you know my thoughts and feelings on it. Drinking big Imperial Stouts here, whether or not they're barrel aged, a little boozy bite is not out of place for me. I actually kind of like it. Lets me know I'm drinking a nice high ABV beer, 12.8%. This is indeed a high ABV beer. As soon as the malts start to come in, those two flavors are really intermingling very, very well. All the barrel aging characteristics and then all these rich, dark, roasty malts. So the beer drinking experience and kind of the layers of flavor and how I'm getting them are not dissimilar to what I got on the Firestone Walker Parabola. The notable exception being the intensity of everything on this one is dialed back just a little bit. The barrel is the most intense part of this beer, but it's not as intense as it was on the first. Same thing with the rich roasty malts. This one's not a Russian Imperial Stout. The first one was. So yes, that roasty quality does come through, and you can pick it out quite clearly in this beer, but it's not that same level of intensity that you get from a classic Russian. So sure, same style, both barrel-aged, similar ABV ranges, but they are distinctly different beers, both fantastic in their own right. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel, finish, think on this flavor development a bit more. Really, really delicious beer. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Second sip, it intensifies. The body on this one I would say is medium heavy. Mouthfeel I would say is resistant but not crazy. So that aspect of this beer is pretty similar to what I got on the first beer. It's not quite as big breadth-wise in terms of the body, and it's not quite as resistant as I expected, though it must be noted that the resistance on this is quite a bit more substantial than it was on the first beer. This does feel thicker on the palate. Agitating around the palate on this one, really you can just feel that resistance, that thickness. It doesn't really get creamy or foamy or silky at all. And, you know, just differences in the beer. But very, very nice. The intensity of the flavors really became more pronounced on that second sip here. And I can tell you that as I'm thinking on it, aside from the fact that this one also has a very, very long finish, and it's kind of the same characteristics as on the Parabola that are pushing it out. It's really equal parts barrel and that the intensity of that roasted malt. The intensity may not be quite as large on this, but it is not making a bit of a difference on that finish. The finish is still going. It's very, very long. That rye whiskey and that roasty malt is really lingering on the palate. Now, what I'm getting on the roasted malt on this is definitely a little bit different than I got on the first. I'm not really picking up any hints whatsoever of coffee. It's pure roasted malt. So there is some cacao-like quality to it. The part of it that reminds me of roasted coffee is really that slight smokiness in the back, but again, it's not like a Rauch beer or a peated scotch. It's not smoky in that regard. And it's not like a campfire, but there's a suggestion of it. Like it's been heated just to the point and then pulled before it hits the smoke point. So it's almost a char-like quality. And the other aspect of this malt bill is this one has a lot of very rich, earthy kind of characteristics that are coming through. So you're getting this dark chocolate, this cacao, this slight smoky suggestion, and this intense earthy presence. And it really, really is quite nice. And frankly, I think that pairs very well with a rye whiskey, because rye does have some very different characteristics and elements than a lot of different grains you could use for different whiskeys. One notably is that in general tends to have a little more spice-like quality to it. Almost like you would think of black pepper or white pepper or even cayenne pepper imparts a little bit of a spiciness to things. You get that in rye. It doesn't taste spice like, oh, I'm tasting cinnamon here. I don't mean that kind of spice. I mean actual Scoville units heat. And without it feeling hot, that's kind of the sensation that rye imparts, at least to me personally. And I know a lot of other people would say that they experience that as well. There are some subtle suggestions of these grassy notes in there as well, and it's really coming from that barrel. Yet again, another characteristic of the rye. Overall, just another fantastic beer, just beautifully balanced, just like the first one. This is another winner. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with the Firestone Walker Brewing Company's Parabola. This is the 2020 release. It's a bourbon barrel-aged Imperial Stout that clocks in at 13.6% ABV, and they are based in Paso Robles, California. Starting with the aroma on this was very classic, big, bold, Imperial barrel-aged Stout. Just massive, massive malt aromas, massive barrel aging aromas. You could get a ton of information just on first sniff, and it was very pungent indeed. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I absolutely love this beer. This beer wasn't quite exactly what I expected. This is one that takes a few sips to really let you get the nuances and intricacies, but the taste was absolutely fantastic. It tasted to me a lot more like a classic stout. There was a lot of the rich classic malt bill character that came through and didn't emphasize as much some of these other kind of things you get in these big beers like this. There was a little subtle hint of coffee, a little subtle hint of chocolate, but by and large it was just really intense roast malt that came through and a nice bourbon barrel back to it. And there were many, many other layers. There were even elements that came through that kind of reminded me a little bit of a barley wine. In fact, on both of these beers. But really, the taste for me, I couldn't have asked for better. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the body on this one did surprise me. It was certainly larger than your average beer, and certainly it was above average for the style, but 13.6, that's a very high ABV on a very big, thick beer. The body just really didn't come through with quite as much breadth as I thought that it would, but it didn't feel completely out of place. It still had a nice hold, above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. The mouthfeel, same story here. It did have resistance. It did have viscosity, just not quite exactly the intensity of either that I was expecting. It's above average here, gets a 7 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was exceptionally long. I mean, exceptionally long. The intensity of the flavors really, really lingered, and that's both the malt and the barrel side of, I mean, I haven't had too many beers that lingered on the palate quite like this one. I mean, it's top tier. Gets a 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, overall this one did a good job. I don't know if this is anything they ever keg that you would find at, say, a specialty bar, but for poured from the bottle at home, it did very, very good job indeed. Well above average. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the appearance, exactly as I anticipated. Absolutely pitch black. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, talked about this a little bit in the flavor, but the balance was just exactly what I wanted. I got full force of the malts and the intricacies there, and same thing on the barrel side, and neither the malts nor the barrel aging aspect were vying for attention. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Overall, this beer did exceptionally well. Just a couple categories where it didn't get perfect marks, and frankly, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't impact the beer drinking experience or deviate so far from the norm that it impacted the overall example score. Yeah, a few things I expected a little more, but to say that it was less than stellar is crazy. Example of the style that gets a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Firestone Walker Brewing's Parabola 2020 release to a 93 out of 100. Well above average, definitely worth seeking. Beer number 2, this is Fifty Brewing Company's Eclipse Rye Cuvee Imperial Stout. 12.8% on this one, rye whiskey barrel aged, and they are based in Truckee, California. Starting with the aroma on this one was equally as pungent on the first. Same story here as well. You could get all of the classic stout malt bill aromas. You could definitely get that sense of that rye barrel, and certainly the barrel itself came through very, very clearly, and tons of nuance in it as well. Aroma gets a perfect 10 out of 10. The taste. The taste on this beer was very complex, just like on the first one. So these two beers at random, first time I've ever had either, they ended up going very well in this kind of pairing because they were both bigger than your average, both definitely interesting barrel-aged beers, but they also had a lot of nuance that not just every Imperial Stout, and indeed even barrel-aged Imperial Stouts do. And that was true on both of these examples. Layers of complex flavor and just equal parts of that barrel and the malt bill, so you didn't have to, really sit there and have your taste buds fighting to try to figure out what it was you were getting. They both came through perfectly clearly. Taste on this one gets a 10 out of 10. Yet again, these beers very similar. The body on this one, it was certainly above average, but yet again, it wasn't quite as robust as I expected for a 12.8% Imperial. It does get a 7 out of 10. Mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this one was a little bit more resistant, a little bit more viscous. This one did still not quite meet my expectations, but it wasn't off quite as far. This one gets above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the finish, here's another one. Just the finish that lasted an insane amount of time, and I mean that. Both of these were ones that are very long period of time sipping beers, and every sip, it's gonna be minutes in between just because the flavor intensity lingers so long on the palate. I mean, just super, super nice long finish that's just packed with flavor. 10 out of 10. Head and retention, this one absolutely did fantastic. I couldn't ask for better poured at home. It gets a 10 out of 10. Appearance, just like the first, absolutely pitch black as expected, gets a 10 out of 10. The balance. The balance on this one is the exact same story as on the first one. Just equal malt and barrel, and you got them both perfectly clearly in an even proportion. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, another one I absolutely loved. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, the example of the style, as you may guess by now, yes indeed it does get a 10 out of 10. So that brings the total score on 50 Brewing Company's Eclipse Rye Cuvee to a 95 out of 100. So all total, we're looking at a 2-point spread, a 93 and a 95. And certainly, while both of these beers were distinctly different, they had a lot of commonality here, both intensity, balance, and subtlety and nuance that you don't get in that many barrel-aged Imperial Stouts. These two are absolutely stellar. If you can get your hands on them, if you like the style, well worth seeking. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.